Listen, folks, I lost 2 viewers. Now I'm down to 21. I had 23, now I'm down to 21. After a year and a half, and at such low numbers, it's me right here. Not really, I don't know who these people are. Not sure who left, but somebody did. Definitely a few folks. Anyway, I haven't put up a sword video in a minute, and that seems to be the most popular type, so let's do one. This inspiration came to a YouTuber, can't remember his last name. Eric's his first name. Cool guy, has a beard, does a lot of katana stuff on his channel. A lot of cutting videos where he does it like 15, 20 seconds, sometimes long. Love his stuff. But he recently obtained a kwama from Windless Steelcrafts. Mine is here. It's this kind of thing. Used by the, who were they? The Cossacks, who also use the famous Shashka sword. Now, sometimes this is spelled Q-A-M-A usually, but I've seen it spelled a little bit differently in other places, and it looks very similar to the Roman short sword in profile, although I seriously doubt there's a connection given the history. It's very close to another weapon known as the kinjal, but the kinjal usually has sloping edges towards the tip rather than the angled, and that's about the only difference I really see, except sometimes, from what I've seen of historical examples, kinjals are a little more decorated. So, he bought one of these. He did a video of some test cutting. He really liked it. But what do we consider something this size? I mean, it's not huge. It's fairly short. In fact, let me get my ruler here. Aha! My keychain of many things. The blade on this kwama is, according to this ruler, right at, I don't know if you see that, right here at about 17 inches, yeah? Hope you can see that. I can't really focus this a little bit, but it's 17 inches. Well, in my personal opinion, something like a dagger or knife, I mean, yeah, we have the German swords we know as Messers, which means knife, but what really we think of as a knife, I kind of think daggers, knives sort of range from, say, maybe 10 inches up to 12 inches. But short swords, in my opinion, really kind of started about 20, 21 inches and up to, say, 25 inches or so, maybe a little more. I don't know where I really topped it out, but things that are in between. There's a lot of weapons in the world, a lot of Filipino blades, things like the cincadella of Italy, that real wide, short kind of blade with the multi-fullers decorated, that kind of was the popular civilian weapon before the rapier rises to prominence. These things, there's a lot of weapons in that size. Their blades are usually somewhere between 17 to about 20 inches. And like the cincadella, often museum curators go, oh, look at this nice thing, put it in the case, we'll deal with it later. There's not a lot of research and not a lot of focus on weapons of this size. And I think part of that is because a lot of them are beefy enough to cut, but certainly are good at stabbing. And unlike things like some of the mangosh daggers you see with rapiers that may have a blade that sometimes gets 17 inches that are very thin and obviously designed just to thrust, or I mean, they may have some limited cutting capacity, but primarily designed for thrust. Some of these weapons I'm referring to, like the Filipino blades and other things, you could look at, like, say, the Chinese butterfly swords, if you know what those are. I'll try to put one here. Amazing. A lot of those are in that range I speak of like 17 to 20 inches. And it's a popular blade length around the world and through various time periods, but what do we call these things? They're sort of daggers and knives, and they're sort of short swords, but they're not quite as long as what many people would consider a short sword to be. Well, that's the point of this video. I have decided to do a video on some of the things in my collection that I consider in the category that I coined a term for this, demi-swords. I mentioned that Eric, he said he liked the term. That's kind of what inspired me to do this video. But demi-swords. Start with, here is a sword-hilted dagger. It was made by Windless at some point. I have a lot of Windless stuff because I live in Georgia, and they're in Georgia, and it's just, you know, they're affordable and very much on the market. But I have the fortunate ability to go there and examine things very often. So often things I picked up are directly at their warehouse, often on sale, and I get to feel them and see them before I get them. So, you know, unlike having to order them offline, I don't tend to get ones that are subpar as they often can be. Anyway, you see that? Guard is fairly thick. Very much a sword-hilted dagger. Did daggers exactly like this exist? I think so, but usually they're not as rare. This would probably be like an early parrying dagger. Most medieval daggers weren't like what we think of as this. They were more like, Scottish daggers or bullock daggers or something like that. I'll do a video on those sometime. But this blade here, I brought this out because I like this dagger specifically as... Oh, it's going to be upside down if I do it that way. Let's flip it this way. We can see the blade is about 14 inches. A little under 14 inches total, all right? Now...
Hola, I shall kill you in your sleep.
Most people think of daggers as being 12, 10 inches, somewhere in that range. This is 14. It's a little bigger. But I wouldn't call this a demi-sword because, honestly, I think that is still daggery enough. It's getting pretty big for a dagger, but it's a dagger. Will it cut? Yeah, it's got some authority to it. It's a fairly wide blade. It has a good point for thrusting, but it is very, very wide compared to some medieval daggers. So, not quite a demi-sword. I would call it a true dagger. And of course, like sword terminology, many terms are kind of subjective. So a demi-sword, to me, may be something you'd still consider a short sword or a dagger. But anyway, next thing in question is some people often tout this thing. What is it? The kukri. Now, this is a fantasy one that was done some years ago, which has this interesting... This is almost like some... what do you call them? Well, Middle Eastern blades have some grip like this, sort of like some sabers and stuff. And guard here is short, but I like the guard. Many kukris don't have guards, but when you thrust with a kukri, you're often at an angle, and there's a little notch around here that helps your hand not go up the blade. But I like the guard on it, and this is almost like some of the Indian kukri that have the talwar hilt that has the disc here and then the guard. So it's very similar, but it's fancy and has this nice marbled effect, which is the same as Windlass's battle cry line, but it's not in it. It was a fantasy one called the Assassins. Go figure that's for. But as you can see, a kukri has a very, very thick blade. It's hefty. Now, its blade is only 12 inches, but its cutting power is disproportionate, partly because of that inward curve, and partly because of the weight. But would I call it a demi-sword? No! I would call this a hefty knife. A little too short for my opinion. But that's just my opinion. It's my turn, my coin, so I can do that. So we'll put that aside. Next we have a Scottish dagger. Of a fairly primitive style. It still has the bulges here, very reminiscent of the bullock dagger from which it descends. Ooh, and look at that. It is pattern welded type Damascus. Not true Damascus like Woot's, but very pretty blade. How long is this blade? The reason I bring this out is because it is longer than many. Many Scottish blades on dirks are about 12 inches. But those are kind of later ceremonial ones. This one's not a particular style. I don't think. I'm drawing tape measure. Not a particular historic design, but it's more reminiscent of early ones. And it has about a 14-inch blade again, so fairly big. Look at that. Almost like a sword blade, right? But I think it's still short enough to consider it just a dirk. Dirk being the Scottish word for dagger, as I understand it. And, well, I don't think dirk and knife and dagger, they're all kind of sometimes fairly interchangeable to a degree. I usually consider knives single-edged and daggers double-edged, but that sometimes doesn't hold true either. Dirk is a Scottish term, which means dagger, but it's usually single-edged and more like a fighting knife. So, it's all very confusing. Anyway, moving on. First sword we'll talk of, again, is the Kwama. It has a, I don't know if you'll ever see that in the light there. Kind of see it a little bit. The horn handle itself is buffalo horn. It's not actually faux anything. It's actually real buffalo horn, so it has a little bit of striation and color to it. It's very dark. It, as I said, is about 17 inches. And since the point of percussion is about here, where the blade is widest, it really does have quite a bit of heft to it. Now, I don't know how these things were held, because when you wear it in the scabbard, these lugs here, these decorative lugs, since the only ones I would stick out. So if I grabbed it as I was pulling out, they would be on towards my knuckles. But it's supposed to help anchor the hand, but they're a little too low for me. But if I flip it around and anchor my thumb over that, I feel more secure with it. But that would be pulling it backwards from the scabbard from the way it's faced. So I really don't know how they held them. Not overly important. But this I would consider a demi-sword, the first one I have. If you see that compared to me, that is long enough to start being there. I'm not going to do any cutting with these or anything. This is going to be a fairly long video because I have several examples to show. This one is Well, the blade of it is from a Confederate-style artillery sword. Mm-hmm. The hilt is just kind of a generic thing that was thrown together. It was bought at a sale as a pieced together sword that Windlass does. They do that often at their sales. They'll have maybe a blade from one sword that's been discontinued, the hilt to another, and they kind of slap them together and sell them for somewhere between $20 and $50. And I think I may have paid $15 for this one, but it's got a decently stitched handle, a nice rib feel to it, and the guard. Now the blade on it, we will measure, is, well, it's going to be a little bit longer because I just put the, it's going to be upside down. I just did this backwards again. It's right to me, wrong to y'all, but we'll try to get this flipped. You can see there, if you can read that, that's 18. That's 18 inches. 18-inch blade. So it fits right where I start to see them as being there. And if you look at that, it's got a fairly thick cross-section. I think I've heard that these are actually kind of this hefty with the originals. And this one, it has a bit of heft to it. It's fairly thick. And I think that's partly to compensate for its short size. Now, I've seen some daggers, I guess you call, I call it a Demi-sword. Windlass used to sell one that they had called a Costile. I don't know if that's accurate for that type of dagger, but the Costiles were, from what I understand, a group that used large kind of daggery weapons, short sword, Demi-swords. They use Demi-swords. And it's more tapering like an actual dagger. But this one kind of flares and has I think the artillery swords were supposed to be designed after Roman or Greek swords or something like that. It had that look. I think they failed. If you've ever seen them, they got these brass hilts that don't look a thing like a gladius. But nonetheless, that would be a Demi-sword. Now this one with this style hilt, I don't know what to call it because it's kind of a hodgepodge. But in comparison, I just so happen to have this sword. Isn't that the same sword? No, actually it's not. You see? Here's the Demi-sword with that hilt, and here's the other one. Now the Demi-sword actually went up with a longer version of the hilt. I don't know why, but this one has a longer blade. Ooh, and it is a blade that was on a replica Katzbalger style German sword with that usually figure 8 guard on them, but this has that same generic hilt. You see this guard on a lot of generic swords, like Viking swords, stuff you can find cheap and stuff. But they're reminiscent sort of some hunting swords I've seen, and sometimes talon swords, which are shorter, so you can compare the two. See, that's a bit longer. Oh, can't even get it in the frame. Let's measure it instead. Okay, let's see. I did this way last time, so let's do it this way. So we start at the hilt and pull it out. We get to at the tip. We have there's the camera. 1, 2, 3, to about, what's that, 24-inch about, 24-inch blade. So this, I think, being over 21 inches, qualifies as a true short sword. You can see, about here, ta-da. Yes, a little bit different in size. Demi-sword, true short sword. Now what's funny about these is this one has a thicker, stiffer blade, and they actually weigh, this one feels like weighs a slight bit less because it's much thinner in cross-section. Incidentally, this blade, the tip of it, although it doesn't have a fuller, is shaped very much like a Viking era sword, but even as short as it is, this is a very good cutting sword, just so you know. Katzbalgers as short swords are really good at cutting, I find. Another short sword, a true short sword, this one, the French briquette, as they call it. I don't remember the spelling of it, but it is considered a short saber. Haha, with the spear point and the false edge. Now, when we measure it from the hilt, I gotta learn how to use this ruler better. I'm in trouble with this. It is about 24.5 inches. So, another true short sword. This one, I should show where these are balanced. I should have done that earlier. Balanced right about there. Pretty good. Very sharp, very nice. Picked that up because, I don't know, I won't be able to show it in this video. It has a slight twist in the blade from the heat treating. And although I don't notice it affecting cutting much, it's slightly warped like this, kind of. So I got it very cheap. I think like $35. But it's really actually still a very good cutter, even despite its flaw. Now, moving on, what shall I show next? Going down the list. This is actually a machete. And I'll show the blade first because, ooh, look at that. If you look, maybe I'll put a picture right over there. The blade is reminiscent of the bigger blade in the Espada y Daga set sold by Traditional Philippine Weapons, or True Philippine. I think it's Traditional Philippine Weapons is the company. And this hilt here is somewhat more reminiscent of some Mediterranean hills, like on falcatas and stuff. So it's kind of a combination. But the blade definitely looks like an Spadi daga. So I measured this one versus the actual Spadi daga on the site, and the blades are about the same length. I also found a review of this very same machete. It's by, I don't know if you'll ever see that, Jungle Master with the eagle. It's actually the guy who reviewed it said it was his second favorite machete ever to review after the Cold Steel. But these things online sell for like $20 or something, 20, 25 somewhere. But you see that? That's 19-inch blade. Ooh. So definitely I would consider this, although it's a machete, if it were a proper sword. I'd say that's a Demi-sword. And it does have some heft to it being a machete. I like it. I've used it for camping. While I was filming, an app of mine that I have set to come on at night to cut the blue light from the screen I'm experimenting with, they say it's good for your eyes. It kicked on and cut off my camera right at the point pretty much where the film stopped now. But I also noticed it's getting pretty long, so I'm going to make it into a two-parter. And this is where we'll stop now. Listen.